G'day everyone and welcome to my Anzac Portrait series. I'm artist Wayne Dowsent and beside me is a painting of a young Nick Carter. Nick served with the 2nd 1st Infantry Battalion in the Middle East. Upon his return home to Australia, he was then shipped over to Papua New Guinea to fight the invading Japanese. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy part 1 of our interview with Mr. Nick Carter.
My name is Norman Carter, but universally known as Nick. It was under that name, Nick, that I joined the army. But prior to that, I'll tell you a little bit about the formative years of my life. I was born in Paddington in 1922. Went to school at Wallara Primary School, which was very handy to Paddington. Lived the life during the Depression in Paddington. The Depression years was something very severe on families in that time. Work was very scarce and people had a very suffering state of affairs. Fortunately, my dad, he had some work and my elder brother was working. However, while still attending primary school, a friend and I decided to take our push bikes and travel to the country looking for work. Unfortunately, there were so many people doing the same thing, looking for work. On our push bikes we got as far as Coffs Harbour, but couldn't go any further. It was too hard, and eventually turned round and came back to Sydney. We weren't very good candidates for attendance at school when we got back to Sydney, and we looked around for work, couldn't get work, and it was coming up to 1939 with the rumblings of war on the horizon. When it became known to us that war was inevitable, we decided to join the army. I enlisted in Paddington. I was underage at the time and I didn't get accepted. But I went back a few months later, and early in 1940 I was accepted into the army and went into the 2nd 1st Infantry Battalion. After a few months training in Ingleburn, we departed on the ship Aquitania for the Middle East. We arrived in the Middle East that year and were made comfortable in a tent city at a camp called Beit Jerja. And it was from there we moved up to the Western Desert in Libya with the intention of trying to capture Libya from the Italian troops there. It was in December 1941 that the campaign for the capture of Bardia, held by the Italians, was put into operation. And eventually, after some weeks, the Italians were subdued and the number of prisoners taken is unforgettable. There were thousands of prisoners. We had more prisoners than what we had our own troops. So fortunately we had secured the Western Desert for the British Army, and it was most essential. People will fail to understand that there was a lifeline through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean Sea to Britain, who relied upon 60% of imports of food and that to survive. So later on it became more known about this critical place, and Rommel, the German general, had the same idea 2 years later when he tried to capture Libya and failed in the bid at El Alamein, where he's defeated by Montgomery. My battalion did not participate in the Alamein factor, but we went to Syria. The idea of sending us into Syria was the fact that the French had betrayed the British by becoming what they called the Vichy French. And it was essential that that the General Staff do something about this, because it looked like the Germans were trying to get Turkey, which is adjacent to Syria, to give them means of passage so they could come down through Syria and be on Montgomery's back door. So we were sent to Syria to quell the Vichy French forces. It was a successful campaign, but a very really battled campaign. The French had so many colonial troops there, like Senegalese, Bays and what have you. But finally we took victory and secured Syria and stopped this business of the Germans coming through Turkey. Ribbentrop, the German emissary, he tried to get the passage of German troops, which would upset the whole strategy of the Middle East at El Alamein, because they would come through the back door. After Syria, we were stationed at Tripoli in the north of Syria, and the next call we obtained was we were to go back to the desert in Libya with the coming advent of the Battle of El Alamein. We arrived back in the desert with all our desert gear and that, then finally we got a note to say, no, we're moving out again. This seemed most peculiar, because we'd just arrived there and they're going to send us somewhere else. We were then put on trains to Port Tewfik, that's on the Suez Canal, and we were taken to the wharf there, and there was a cruise liner, or past cruise liner there, called the Mount Vernon. We boarded the ship, the Mount, this is in 1942. We boarded the ship there, had no idea where we were going. We had no idea at all. But it became known later we were heading back to Australia. Well, we boarded the ship, but it was all American crew, an all-American captain on the ship. And everybody was it was part of the intelligence setup, not to make it universally known where we were going, because that was the policy. Whenever the troops moved anywhere, intelligence was the main thing, and they couldn't sort of advertise it. But we got known that on the ship back to Australia, there was rumblings of things being bad. That would have been in February. Darwin had been bombed. Burma was just about to fall to the Japanese forces, and the convoy got a direction from Winston Churchill to turn up the Bay of Bengal and head for Rangoon, the capital of Burma. We said, we didn't know where we were going, because the platoon commander was sitting on deck. He says, we're travelling north. We should be travelling east rather. We should be travelling east to Australia. He says, we're travelling north. Well, it turned out later on, the facts were made known in the history books. Churchill's told us to go there. The captain rebelled against it because he was under orders from President Roosevelt to get us back to Australia. Then John Curtin, our Prime Minister, came into it, and Churchill says, "You've got to take those Australian troops to Burma." He says, "No, I'm not." And that started the decent old bun fight. So the ships turned around again and we finished up in Adelaide. Trained there for some weeks in preparation for the Owen Stanley campaign. But in the meantime, as I say, Darwin had been bombed and everybody was in a sort of a mess. We were in Adelaide. They thought, well, preempt to the sort of a bombing of a place is the code for invasion. So they thought an invasion was going to come around the Darwin area. But the strange part was, how were they going to send a whole division, this is the 7th Division, from Adelaide to Darwin? There was no train and there was no road in those times. Nobody ever thought of that, so we went back to Woodside Camp. We never moved for a while, and then we got the orders to in train, and we got a train, and where did it take us to? Casino in New South Wales. And people don't know this. We set up battlefront provisions at Casino. This is before the Brisbane line. And they established ammunition dumps, they established everything in Casino. And then we got another move. We moved up a little bit to Caboolture in Queensland, west of Brisbane. And this is the whole division movement, mind you. And we just sat pat there while the official announcement was we were going to leave that top part of Australia and the Brisbane line was going to be the first line of defence. But we waited there for some time, then after the Battle of the Coral Sea, they thought it was a good time to convoy the troops because Japanese Navy had been defeated. So we landed in New Guinea in August 1942.